My dad was 82 years of age. He had chronic kidney disease. He had suffered through a pneumonia that they finally diagnosed in May of that year, which was the earlier misdiagnosis I was in reference to. He'd been on an inhaler. He had high blood pressure, high cholesterol. He'd had a quintuple bypass. He'd had a stent put in. He had peripheral artery disease. He had diabetes. And his chronic kidney disease was in stage 3. We were lucky to keep him at high stage 3. And he had, as they put it, so many comorbidities that I was surprised that they even attempted to do a surgery. But obviously they had already made themselves responsible for him enough by misdiagnosing him that they had to do something. They had to offer some form of treatment by then due to the misdiagnosis, otherwise they wouldn't be here. It would be very fair to go even further than that. I was told by the thoracic surgeon that the surgery they were going to perform upon him was the most painful surgery that they could do, and that it would be important beyond belief that he would have a pain pump implanted so that they could control the pain afterwards. And in fact, he never did have that done. In fact, they misdiagnosed him from May of that year, 2009, up until his death on August 27th. Once they got inside of him after they'd already cut him open, determined that in their estimation there was nothing that could be done for him, they tried to put a spin on it, of course, and say that he had so much cancer it was beyond saving. But after he did die, he languished in the hospital. He developed dementia within days because his values in his systems kept changing. They wouldn't do anything other than a perfunctory blood test. They wanted to keep him medicated so that, to me, it wasn't quite as evident that he was slipping and slipping quickly. And toward the end, they said that they needed to put him back into ICU, put him on a ventilator. And I watched 5 people who were supposed to be transferring him stand around for a matter of hours. It took about 4 hours. And then he did end up going into cardiac arrest and dying. So they wanted to make sure that not only did they do nothing for him, but they went so far as 2 days before he died, the doctor who was supposed to be following his recovery took himself off of my father's case, leaving him without a doctor. The fact that they treated me poorly afterwards was something that I could have lived with, but in fact it was the way that they treated my father, not only as though he wasn't a human, but as though he didn't matter. There was nothing about his care that mattered to them at the time. I could get no one to respond for anything in order to help him. And I began looking for an attorney around September of 2009. And I made an average of 4 to 5 calls a day, 3 to 5 days a week, and contacted attorneys literally from one end of California to the next, from Northern California all the way down to San Diego. And so I would imagine I spoke with a minimum of 100 to 150 attorneys, or attorneys that I was sent to by attorneys who would not touch the case but recommended that I would call, stating that they probably would accept the case. I could tell that there was a great deal of respect for you, and I would go so far as to say a fear of you as far as Kaiser coming up against you, if that's the proper terminology. As far as your representation, you were not the attorney they wanted to see opposite the table next to me in a case that I know that they took for granted as a slam dunk, as far as me walking away from them without ever accepting responsibility and certainly without ever making payment. The result made me glad that I had somebody who could speak for me in a forum that I clearly was not going to be able to speak for myself and for my father. And that was what counted to me, was making sure that my father was recognized as a human and that Kaiser needed to admit their fault and that what they had done to him was wrong.
The first time we went in there, it was we thought she was going to go into labor, and it was a false alarm. Went back home. The next day or the day after, she had intense pain on her side. So I ended up calling 911 for them to come and get her. So the ambulance came, transported her to the hospital. When she was there, she still complained of pain on the side. It was the assumption that the pain was attributed to due to her being in labor. 20 minutes after being in the hospital, they had diagnosed her and said that she still wasn't delivering. At the time, they weren't sure what the pain was. So I do recall hearing a nurse stating that she wasn't dilated enough to, for her to really be in labor, and her water hadn't broken. My wife and I kept just looking at each other, knowing that something was wrong. And then shortly after that, her water broke, and we went from she's not going into labor to, she's now, her water broke, and they ended up calling a doctor. The doctor came out, and shortly after that, my daughter was born. From there, she was transported to a different room to recover. During that process there, my wife kept stating that she still had severe pain on her side abdomen, and they would come and they would check on her, and they just kept stating that it wasn't that it was just normal pain, and in some cases it was make sound as if she was just complaining, and it wasn't something serious. Later that day or the next day, the doctor came, checked her out. She explained the pain, and again, he didn't call out any concerns. We ended up being released. We went home. When we got home, my wife still wasn't feeling well. She started getting a fever, started throwing up, and she still had a hard time moving around. So we went back to the hospital and stated that she was really sick. We were in the emergency room. This must have been like at 12 a.m. And it wasn't until almost morning time when we were transported to an actual room from the emergency room. And we waited all this time, and the doctor never showed up. And still the pain kept getting worse and worse. At some point I went to the nurse and said, we need to get someone here. And by this time, I would say it must have been like 5 or 6 p.m. Finally, when the doctor came to see her, it must have been closer to 8, 9 o'clock that evening. He came in, and he just made some observations, and there was no concern on his point. And I don't know if, again, it did very clear that he just wasn't paying attention to a lot of the information that was given to him as far as what happened and what were some of the symptoms that she had experienced. The pain was so intense that even the subtle touch on the skin would also should have raised a red flag that this was going on. Problem with the appendix, and it's about to rupture, and ruptures that those are some signs that usually doctors look for, and even nurses that identify, and those were some of the first things that they look for. After my wife's passing, I wasn't clear as to what needed to happen then. I was just focused on everything going on at home and with my kids, and dealing with my newborn daughter. My wife's cousin had approached, and she had suggested that I need to seek legal guidance for this and support. And at the time, I wasn't sure what to do or who to call. So she referred me to you. I'm very happy and pleased over the fact that I had an opportunity to work with you and that you were able to represent me. I felt nothing but comfort and respect throughout the whole process, that you were not only out there looking for yourself, and this was just a job in another case, that you were truly very understanding as to what happened, what my needs were. You really cared about me and my family, ensuring that we saw this too, and that someone truly that you want to keep close by, and someone that I would recommend to others.
My husband was scheduled for typical hip replacement surgery, and he had had anesthesia issues for a previous hip replacement, and we had spoken to anesthesiologists and the doctors just to make sure they knew about this. Basically, he had the surgery, he was up that day walking, ready to go home, and then suddenly everything just went down. He became very, very ill. They were testing for a blockage of his intestines, so they gave him a pink contrast. And in doing an X-ray, They put him into an x-ray tube flat on his back, and he vomited and aspirated. And there was supposed to be 2 people watching him, and there was nobody. I think one of the statements that they made was, if this was a case where a surgical instrument was stitched up in his body, then this is a slam dunk case. But there's really not enough evidence here of malpractice or incompetence. I mean, it feels disrespectful. It feels arrogant on their part. It feels like they don't care. And Bill challenged that. Yeah. I wanted us to make a difference and have change. That was what was unusual. We were looking for change in medical protocol, which I think was pretty much unheard of. And it took a lot of work on your doing, but you gave me what I wanted. We sat down with both sides of the party, and we had a civilized conversation. And the result of that was change of protocol in the medical arena. After the case, maybe 2 weeks after the case, we were informed that USC hired 6 independent staff members to only follow and track post-orthopedic surgery patients to recovery, because that was a huge missing link in my husband's case. I would only recommend Bill Newkirk. He listened to me. That's very important. Bill, you always kept me in the loop. You told me realistically what was going to happen. You made me a participant. I wanted to be a participant. You gave me realistic expectations all along the way, and I really appreciated that. You don't have an attitude that, you're more important, you know more than I do, and sign the check. And that's not how you operate. Not only do you have the skill set, the broad knowledge, the experience of handling these cases, but you have compassion.